everyone, and welcome to the Lake Arrowhead Symposium webinar titled Transit and Transition, Transit for People. I'm delighted to moderate this panel of dynamic speakers, thinkers, and advocates for advancing transportation equity. Our aim here is to highlight tools and frameworks that are currently in use in the state of California, as well as more broadly across the United States, for operationalizing transit equity. Here we have our speakers. We have David Bragdon, who is the Executive Director of the Transit Center. We also have Therese McMillan, as well as her colleague, Nalundo Conley. I'll introduce Therese and I'll ask that she introduce her colleague during her presentation. Therese is currently the Executive Director at MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and she has served in that role as well as the top executive for the Association of Bay Area Governments since 2019. And also we have Jessica Meany, who is the founder and executive director of Investing in Place, an organization committed to transportation investments that strengthen communities. So let's get started with our first set of speakers, Therese McMillan and Nalundo Conley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bills, for that introduction, and I am thrilled to be able to participate in this session. I've been an active participant as well as speaker for Lake Arrowhead, and am completely committed to the work that you do to bring sometimes very difficult topics to the forefront and bring to lever a collaborative space for how we might be able to deal with them. And certainly equity falls in that band. So what I'd like to do while my colleague Nalundo Conley is bringing up the presentation is introduce her. Nalundo has been with our agency 2 years. She came shortly after I joined and is my chief of staff, as well as my administrative director, and has been my right-hand person in advancing the equity platform, which is the topic that we'll be speaking to today. So if we can bring up the presentation,
okay,
we'll get started.
I think I can do this. Bear with me here.
Terrific.
Okay.
Okay.
Coming up.
Go to full screen. Can you put it on full screen? That would be helpful. It's
Is that not
at the top? I think the little. There we go. Terrific.
there?
Okay. If everyone's like me, so a bigger presentation is good for the eyes. So we'll start there. Our presentation is titled Equity at a Regional Scale. And what we'd like to do is really speak to the role that regional agencies have in the space of equity. And it is different, right? I think everyone definitely has a role and a critical place in advancing this, but regional agencies have different layers, certainly in the Bay Area, within which that we can raise this. And we're going to highlight 3 specific areas that sort of demonstrate that range. One is our long-range plan, Plan Bay Area 2050, which you might say is sort of the largest forum for addressing equity. We'll be speaking specifically to a operational program, Clipper Start, which is a discount program on fares for our transit operators. And then also the work that we're doing, working with the community in a number of ways, but specifically our equity bench, which speaks to one of the pillars we'll be talking about on the next slide, and Nalundo has been spearheading that. So let's go to the next slide. So this is all built on the equity platform. And the equity platform actually I developed and introduced that when I worked at LA Metro. Jessica Meany, our friend and colleague who will be speaking later, was front and center on that development. But the key thing to realize is that the equity platform is not a project. It's not a program, which is what often us regional planners are really, familiar with, but it's basically a paradigm shift in our thinking and commitment that equity needs to be infused in all lines of the agency's business. And there's 4 pillars upon which that equity lens can be applied, and I'll go through them briefly. Excuse me. The first is define and measure, and that gets to the heart of the question of what is equity? And that is not an easy answer to, or easy question or answer to put forward. I would hazard a guess, you ask 15 people what equity is, and you will get 15 different answers, very often with common threads. But equity often reflects where you sit, what your personal experience has been, and the like. And yet it is important to develop those spaces within which a common understanding of equity for purposes of identifying, importantly, where inequity exists and how we might take conscious steps to address and change that inequity is important. At the heart of that, though, is measure. One of the things that I have come to appreciate in the time I've worked in this space is for a long time, equity was very much advanced, driven, and discussed based on personal experience, which is hugely helpful and is a core part on Listen and Learn that we'll get to in a moment. But on the other hand, in order to particularly develop solutions, evaluate their effectiveness, and monitor effective change, you need to have concrete data. You need to have concrete measurements on equity, and particularly, again, where disparities exist on various levels. So the first platform is really getting our arms around that is a critical part on where to start in terms of thinking about how you address equity in our work. The second pillar, I've often said in presentations like this, in many ways is the most important and impactful insofar as equity is about people. And it is critically important as we, as professionals or advocates, local elected officials and the like, are again trying to understand and address inequities and disparities, often almost canyon level gaps in how we provide services, how we advance investments, how we frame legislation, whatever part you'd be, is to realize at the end of the day, this is affecting people. And too often in the past, what we have done, particularly those of us lucky enough to sit in seats of privilege in terms of our positions or our own experiences, have assumed that we know what the experience of equity has been in a particular community, and we develop a proposed way of dealing with it and then shop it around to folks that we really want to assist and help. The problem is that we have not often started with the fact of listening to the community who has experienced the inequities, who have experienced the racial injustices, who have experienced the fact that there is widening gaps on wealth, on income, on education, on almost every metric, public health, and listen to their perspectives and their stories to validate first the inequities historically that happened there, and second, to identify where we start in terms of defining the problem from their perspective and the range of solutions that they collectively need to be at the table to do. So that is really at the core of Listen and Learn, and I think brings in the point I was saying before. That's where personal narrative, lived experience is in fact an important data point as well, and needs to be worked into our thinking. The third pillar, focus and deliver, is really about outcome and really about change, which is to say, we can define and measure and listen and learn and problem identify, but if we're not moving into the space of actually making changes on the ground that close those gaps, that disparities that we've seen, and how they're evidenced, then we're falling far short of actually dealing with the problem and making a meaningful impact for those that most need it. And focus and deliver, again, is along a broad spectrum. It can be investments in infrastructure. It can be changes in regulation. It can be infusing operational capacity in a very different way. For example, with a transit agency, who do you serve? How do you serve them? What's the quality of the service? And where does that line up with seen inequities? So that's focus and deliver. Train and grow is incredibly important as well, which is to say, in this space of equity, no single agency owns the corner of knowledge of what this whole process means, and particularly how best to meet people where they are. And it acknowledges, and again, in the development of this, both at LA Metro and with the San Francisco Bay Area, that MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or the Association of Bay Area Governments, and all our staff that serve those agencies have a lot of continuing knowledge, learning to do in terms of deepening our knowledge and skills in advancing this space. And then continued growth. This is an effort that is never done. Back to close, and we can then go on to our next slide. Not a project, not a program with an end. This is something that will always be in front of us, and we always have to align and commit to. So the next slide.
Sorry. My computer seems to have frozen. I apologize. Is that working now?
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
So let's talk about Plan Bay Area 2050, our long-range plan that I'm sure many in our audience are familiar with, something that regional agencies need to do every 4 years. It's a federal and state requirement. The point here is that when we developed our blueprint, and we've been working on it for 4 years, and next week, hopefully it will be adopted by MTC and ABAG, we knew that this had to be a foundationally different plan than in the past. And that we needed to focus on how we could highlight and acknowledge the synergies between 4 major areas: transportation, housing, the economy, and the environment. That we could no longer work in silos, that was not helping us. And frankly, the problems that we see are interconnected across these spaces, and the solutions necessarily need to be that as well. Importantly, it's also very objective oriented. That it's not about just the inputs, about things that we put into the plan, but more, how does it affect our communities to make them more affordable, more connected, more diverse, healthier, and more vibrant for everyone, and particularly for our most vulnerable populations. Next slide. In doing that, we adopted, there's back in the fall, but it wasn't this fall, it was the fall before when you think about these themes. 11 different themes and 35 strategies about how we would get there. This isn't, again, this is a long range plan. It is not, it doesn't assign specific dollar commitments to specific projects. It does not in and of itself advance policies or particular advocacy changes or legislation. Instead, it presents where we want to go and how we might get there via the strategies that we adopt. And as you can see here, there's a whole host of them, the orange representing, if you can see those colors, sort of transportation-oriented strategies or thematic strategies that nest there. of housing, critically important. It continues to be the most critical crisis, if you will, that the region is facing. Economy, which in a Bay Area, unfortunately, that has one of the highest GDPs and economic footprints, not only in the country, but the world, with massive disparities in gaps and wealth and the like, a major equity issue. And then also in the environment, where we made huge strides in terms of a plan in advancing specific focuses around what we do collectively on climate change. Let's go to the next slide. So what I'd like to do in the next few slides is illustrate again the metrics, the performance orientation of this plan, where we also intentionally within that didn't deal just with the averages that we see across the region, but tried to hone in on the impacts on our equity priority communities. So just as an example, and again, for many of you on here, this dynamic of how much out of pocket folks have to pay for transportation and housing, this will not be a surprise in terms of a pie chart. But just to illustrate, when we started at the beginning of the process using a baseline of 2015, where a lot of our baseline data was available, the split at that time, sort of on the ground average for the Bay Area, was pretty astounding numbers of 33% of household income being spent on housing, 25% on transportation, leaving less than half available for critical other needs. And as you might imagine, for lower income populations, that burden is far, far bigger. We'll be able to illustrate that in the next couple of slides. In terms of an overall outcome as an illustration, significant gains, again, with the idea that this is a plan, and if all the strategies were put into place, which is a huge lift, mind you, and not assumed, but if they were, we could anticipate reducing housing burden from 33% to 21% of average household income, and transportation down by 1%, which seems small, except when you start thinking about the synergistic effects of housing and transportation, such that the jobs housing imbalance often greatly increases and impacts the nature of transportation. So in many ways, our gains are, you may be investing in transportation, but it's going to be much more efficient for you as compared to what you did before. So the next slide. Let's start digging a little deeper. And we have 3 examples from, again, a very comprehensive way of looking at our performance orientation in the plan, which is the idea of going back to asking these important outcome questions. Here's one example of a question of, will the region, and again, I failed to just clarify for some of our participants, the San Francisco Bay Area consists of 9 counties. We're almost 8 million people, 27 different transit operators, 101 different jurisdictions, very diverse, in some ways sort of very challenging because of that diversity on many levels. But one of the things that we're very mindful of is that averages sometimes don't speak to the significant differences that we see across the region. But in this case, the question is, among others, will it be more affordable with respect to housing and transportation? And as we had illustrated on the first slide, we had a relentless focus on housing because of its critical impact, disproportionately so in our region. And as you can see, in the slide here, the average household income spent on housing plus transportation shifts from 58% to 45% of baseline compared to the final plan. But critically, when we put an eye to our low income vulnerable communities, the improvement is hugely different. Going from 113%, I'll apologize right here. I know there's I want to say it's due to sort of carried debt in the housing space that it's more than 100%. But the point is, it was really big for our most vulnerable low income communities. And to be able, again, to project that if the combination of affordable housing availability in terms of production, preservation, and protection were pursued, we could bring that number down to 58%, which is a significant shift. Let's go to the next slide. Similarly, on transportation, one of the metrics was, is it more connected? And in this case, yes, the way that the plan is developed, and very critically, how it is matched with where housing is located in terms of future growth, pointed to some really significant projected improvements. Job accessibility by transit, because climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing congestion and the like, very much is about the mode shift from cars to alternative modes of transportation. In this case, for housing, the jobs accessibility would, as one metric, illustrative metric, would go from 131,000, where you could access your job in 45 minutes or less, to 276,000. But when we focus on we say here community of concern needs to be updated. We have changed with working with our communities. We have redefined this metric to equity priority communities. So, just note that there's, again, in that ever important, learning as we go space, that was an important acknowledged change from our listen and learn. But in any case, you can see dramatically higher level of shift here. And when you note, 427, it's also a note that even with the acknowledged suburbanization of poverty and other metrics, many of our lower income communities are located in our denser parts of the Bay Area, where public transit actually performs better and is also richer in terms of a starting point. So that may explain, some of the differences there. The question, though, also was, and this is where, we don't always achieve everything we want to see. Will the transportation system be more reliable? And we had different metrics for that. And in the case of traveling by auto, because the plan reduces congestion significantly by year 2050, you would expect more reliability on the roads. One of the areas, though, that as we modeled and forecast that was still a challenge, though, was crowding on our transit systems. So while we had the accessibility improve, as noted above, the issue was, what's the quality of that trip? And that was one of the areas where we didn't make as much progress as we wanted, and as a focal point for attention going forward. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Nalongo now, because as I indicated in just the prior slide, it's important also to recognize when we're evaluating equity, where we still have a long way to go. And where in our long range plan in particular, we didn't achieve everything that we had hoped for. So Nalongo, why don't you take it from here on this slide?
Sure, thank you, Therese. So, I think, as you can see from the slide, diversity, as we know, really is the hallmark of any sort of equitable solution. And, having more inclusive communities not only make available to those who've been marginalized, increased access to resources, but they also provide economic benefits by cutting the costs associated with other services or amenities. And so, while the final blueprint, as you can see here, doesn't result in huge increases to the share of low-income households in high-resource areas, as Teresa has maintained, this long-range plan does not exist in a vacuum. And so it is just one piece of, a whole suite, I think, of actions that we're hoping to take to actually really be more impactful. And RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, is sort of one of those policies and strategies that, coupled with this long range plan, we hope will sort of move these equity indicators even further. And so, as we can see here, that, will the Bay Area residents be able to stay in place? You can see the answer is, it depends, right? And so, you know, it is possible that because we've, you know, improved some of the housing, transportation relationships or access for people, especially those who are living in equity priority communities, they may choose to move, but it's more so of a choice rather than displacement. So again, I think this is just indicative of the fact that equity is iterative, it's ongoing, and I think these are questions that we just have to continue to ask. You know, folks in this space and who are most impacted by these plans and these policies, just to ensure that we're getting the results, you know, that are intended.
And with that, I realize we're at time, so I'm going to go to the next slide and spend 30 seconds on it. And then, you know, since I'll need to leave, unfortunately, except I'm going to deal with a critical meeting on affordable housing, so it kind of connects to the topic. Nalongo, I think in the question and answer perhaps can really focus on the effort we're doing on our equity bench. So maybe we won't do the slide there, but, you know, continue that focus in the Q&A. But really quickly, I want to just mention 30 seconds Clipper start. Clipper is our universal fare card. And one of the things that I wanted to mention on equity is very often you need to step into the door of opportunity. And COVID-19, for all of the tragic and unprecedented burdens and impact it exerted across the space. One of the things that it really helped to catalyze and accelerate was a means-based approach to transit fares in our region. And we had a pilot in place for reducing fares with 5 of our 27 different operators in advance of COVID. But once the pandemic hit and we realized the additional burdens on our essential workers and on our transit dependent folks that had to continue riding transit, even with the massive plummet of ridership throughout the region, we had 17 of our 27 different operators jump on board in again, a pilot program to commit to reducing fares for those that have incomes at 200% below poverty level. And so again, to illustrate where you can do the long range and the big picture, you can also target where equity can be put on the ground to respond to circumstances and very quickly. So with that, I'll conclude. Sorry for going over. I'll turn it back to Dr. Bills. And again, my apologies for having to leave you, but Nalongo will stay on and participate in the rich discussion. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Teresa. I know we run over, so I actually will skip my last slide, but I can speak to it and come back to it in relation to some of the other actions that MTC has taken relative to equity, you know, and how it sort of cross-cuts, you know, the long-range plan and some of the other activities. Since I know we went a little long.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Nalongo and Teresa, for that really exciting presentation about the work going on with the equity platform at NTC. I want to remind our audience to please enter in your questions in the Q&A tool, and we will pull from those questions during our discussion session after our speakers, where we'll hear more from Nalongo, and she will have an opportunity to wrap up final thoughts then. So let's move on to our next speaker. Next, we have David Bragdon, who is the Executive Director of Transit Center. His work at Transit Center works to improve transit in order to make cities more just and environmentally sustainable. Before Transit Center, David served nearly 8 years as president of the Metro Council in Portland, Oregon metropolitan area, and the only directly elected regional government in the nation. So with that, we will have David give his presentation.
Oh, thanks very much, Dr. Bills. It's good to be here. The last time I was at Arrowhead, literally here, was not here, but you all made a lot of fun. I'm a New Yorker here, greetings from New York, and it was the case of the West Coast revenge. You said you put me on at 8 p.m. at night because it would be 11 p.m. my time. And you said that was revenge for all the meetings that West Coast people have to come to and have 9 a.m. meetings when it's 6 a.m. for you. So now here we're in our time zone. I'm looking out at the Hudson River, but I'm pretending I'm up on the Zen yoga platform overlooking Lake Arrowhead, and look forward to being able to do that again with you sometime. So good to share virtually. I'm David Bragdon, Executive Director of Transit Center. We're a civic organization. We're a foundation dedicated to making cities more livable and just and sustainable through better transit. And often when you go to transit conferences, we'll see a photograph like this. This happens to be Portland in the 1990s when I lived there, and sort of an idealized picture of transit, multimodalism, and trees and urbanism. And we at Transit Center are idealists. We like to be idealistic too, but we're also realistic. And so part of the imagery that we use to motivate our work is unfortunately a more accurate picture of what transit looks like in much of the United States and what we are working to fix. The reality is that most of the United States, public transit is really substandard quality. It's underprovided, it's underused, it's inequitably provided in a number of different ways that we're going to address here today. And prior to COVID, in most localities, ridership had been falling for years. So there are real problems to fix there. And we have a very clear theory of why those conditions persist, why transit is substandard in this country. And our theory is pretty clear, and it's a little unconventional, again, compared to what you often hear sort of at transit conferences or in circles. You often hear, well, it's just not enough money. We don't have enough money. And you hear, oh, well, we just need the new technology. New technology is going to be the answer. Well, we don't think those are actually the root causes of why transit is substandard in this country. In fact, the United States is actually a technology savvy country. So it was lack of technology. The United States would be a leader rather than a laggard as it is in transit. And in terms of money, this is actually a very rich country. We have a lot of money. It's just in transportation, as in many other things, we actually spend it on the wrong things, and we spend it in inequitable ways. So the difference between why Vienna has good transit, it's not just about Vienna. Why is Vienna better transit than we do? It's also Winnipeg or Halifax or Perth, other cities that are of comparable land uses and demographics as this country. Well, so if it's not money and it's not technology, what is the difference between us and those countries that explains why our transit is substandard to theirs? In one word, it's power. It's the who has power in our society, who has power in our elective system, in our representative systems, including transit agencies. Other countries have more responsive, accountable governance structures for transit. Their society and their leadership value transit and operate it and value it and plan it accordingly. Now, there are all kinds of historic reasons. Prominently, race is clearly one of the reasons for that disparity. Gender, the role of ideology, those are all, but so are the governance structures that are opaque and unaccountable, and kind of the absence of goals for what we're trying to achieve with transit. So we believe, in terms of our theory of making that difference, the remedy for that is to tap into the latent power of the community, activate people, and help the people who are working for better transit, people who depend on transit. We'll often know what many of the answers are, and we survey them to find out as well. And to make systemic changes to governance and practice. Governance and practice being questions like, who decides? Who's on transit boards who are making these decisions? Who's sitting in those conference rooms? How do we plan? What are the tools that we use when we're planning? What are the techniques that we use? What are the goals and outcomes we're trying to achieve? Well, we think the key to all of that change really is people, in particular, two categories of people. It's the people who depend on transit and the people who run and operate transit. And we believe that to make these changes, we have to continually remind ourselves transit is purely instrumental to societal outcomes. It doesn't exist for its own sake. And in our book, it is instrumental to making society a more equitable place and more sustainable environment and a shared prosperity for all. So to understand what it is that makes transit appealing and important to riders, we do surveys. A lot of our publications relate to the rider experience, as well as technical documents about how agencies respond to those and how agencies provide better service and improve their practices. And one of our works back in 2018 was the Inclusive Transit Report, which came out back in 2018 and really addressed some of the shortcomings in the current approaches to equity, and in particular Title VI, and put forward some proposed changes in mentality and approach. Really, Title VI as it exists today really just encourages sort of a minimal compliance, check the box. It is designed to prevent things from getting worse. Typical kind of legalistic point of view of what's the worst that can happen, let's prevent things from getting worse, as opposed to an aspirational, how do you move things forward? And that's what we called for in this report, a more aspirational approach to achieving and improving things rather than just not making them worse. So that led us more recently then in the past year to develop a dashboard that would really help to measure in terms of equity. Now, there's an industry that measures tons of things. You look at the National Transit Database or any kind of report, on-time performance, mean distance between failures, miles of track, all kinds of measurement goes on in the industry all the time. Most of those measures are intrinsic to the thing itself, the characteristics of the transit itself, not the outcome or the societal impact, or even just taking it down to the individual level, the benefit to the user and who that user is, who is benefiting and who's being burdened. The cleaner air that's produced, or dirty air that's averted by transit, GHG that's avoided. Those are the things that we think are very important to be measured and often are not. I've heard Therese speak elsewhere and quotes Manuel Pastor, and I don't think she did today. So I'm going to quote Therese, quoting Manuel Pastor, saying that the measurement part is so important. We certainly agree with that, particularly in moving from the compliance mindset that exists today in Title VI to a more aspirational one of what we're actually trying to achieve, get beyond the limitations of current sort of Title VI mentality, and have a tool that would help us set goals and measure progress rather than just avert more harm. So we've developed a tool which was released June 15th, called the Transit Equity Dashboard, that really has a couple of innovations to it. One is it looks at regions as opposed to particular agencies or projects, really deals with people's lives rather than sort of geographic areas, and is not just about the journey to work, but about access to a lot of other things as well. Living a full life, basically saying, can you live without a car, without the burdens of that $10,000, $12,000 a year burden of car ownership? Can you live a full life? We focus on 7 of the biggest ridership cities across the country. We worked with Professor Alex Karner on this. San Francisco, for you Californians, and know that most of the group here is California, San Francisco, the Bay Area, and Los Angeles are part of this. And basically, in a nutshell, it really combines schedule information, typical transit data, with demographics and census data in terms of who lives where and where are they trying to go and what kind of mobility do they get. We really think of our research as applied research. We want it to be used by practitioners. We want to move from just awareness to action, and to really have planners, decision makers at agencies, as well as advocates, understand how our transportation systems produce good or bad outcomes and for whom, and then as a tool to help them plan service changes that will reduce or eliminate those inequities and move us further forward. So those are really our 2 major audiences that we would like to have making use of this new tool. Again, the 2 audiences that we have focused on now for the 8 years of my time at the Transit Center, certainly, the people that make change are those community-based advocates who really understand what it is that matters to riders in terms of the provision of the fundamentals of good service. This gives them a way to measure that in a way that also relates to equity and turns equity from sort of a concept into something that is measured in terms of the access that people have. And this tool allows advocates to really be able to talk to agencies in the quantitative sorts of terms that agencies are sometimes oriented toward in a very tangible sort of way. And it's also something that can be used to monitor practice. Now, for practitioners, on the other hand, who want to embrace this approach, or transit agency boards, I mean, for that sector of our audience, it's again something tangible. They can see how they are actually doing and the steps that they need to take. So both of those audiences really very important for us. Some of the features in the dashboard, it includes the ability to look at service levels at different times of the day. It's not just about tracks being in the ground or a line on a map. It's also just what kind of access do you have at 10 p.m. relative to 9 a.m. relative to a Sunday afternoon, and being able to look at that way. That frequency is part of it. Again, one of the most important things to the rider is the frequency. And then also the ability to compare with car access. And we always, as transit people, need to be reminding ourselves while we're comparing one transit scenario to another, the most inequitable system of all is the one that requires people to use and own automobiles, and the huge cost burden as well as environmental burden that cars place on our society. We should always remind ourselves of that. There are still some, drawbacks or things yet to be perfected in terms of maybe being able to measure reliability, for example. That's a bit harder. And so there are other factors. We do base this on scheduled data rather than the actual, and that's been also with schedules having been in flux during COVID and the service being cut or added. And then, so that's also an issue in terms of maintaining it. And again, sort of defining sort of the areas that we're talking about beyond sort of agency boundaries without going too far afield in terms of the urban areas. So judgment calls in how the tool was developed. So here are just some examples. I've just so you get a flavor. This would be an example of hospital access focused on Brooklyn in this case. Not a journey to work trip, but one that's very important to a lot of people, getting to a doctor appointment. What does it take to access healthcare? We're gonna do something similar with supermarkets. Actually, there's another foundation for other reasons wanting to use a similar tool about polling stations, right? And when we hear about voter suppression going on in this country, actual transportation access is an issue. Somebody would like to use an approach like this to correlate that as well. In terms of jobs, here's an example from the New York region, a very stark example where access to jobs broken down by race here shows that for the average white resident can access 86% more potential jobs in 45 minutes than the average Black resident. A huge, huge discriminatory impact on who can get access to jobs, who can basically go make a living. This is the role of our transportation system in terms of having that type of access. So we'd love to have agencies, again, the two audiences for us, we'd love to have agencies using this to guide their investments and guide their service changes, guide how they're scheduling, how they're providing service. And then we'd love to have advocates using this to help shape the requests, the demands that they make of agencies, and also monitor progress. And I'd say we have allies as Transit, we have allies on both sides of this ledger here. We work, for example, with LA Metro right there in your region. We have a memorandum of understanding with their equity office on using equity tools. Beyond this is just one of several projects that we have. And at the same time, Jessica Meany, who you're about to hear from, is one of our field partners as well. So we work with both sides of that. In fact, we're all on the same side, really. We're all in favor of better transit. And this particular tool really is just one of many that agencies can use, many very progressive agencies. One right up the road from you in San Francisco, of course, Muni, having had an equity strategy and really applied a lot of this on the fly kind of during the pandemic in terms of prioritizing service. Bus network redesigns, go back to Portland in 1986, the kind of the granddaddy of them all, or Houston in 2015. Equity might not have been a big consideration at that time. The one that was adopted in Miami just this week actually was rider-led, actually first in the country where the advocacy organization led a redesign. Equity being a specific, explicit goal. MBTA use similar types of approaches. There are lots of different ways to use the data, short-term, long-term, in terms of where they were. This is a blog on transitcenter.org from last summer in terms of MBTA similar. We have other examples we've written about, Metro Transit in the Twin Cities, how they allocate bus stops through various quantitative means of assessing need, as well as qualitative needs of listening to riders, one of those pillars that Therese talked about, and hearing the stories of riders and where they were waiting and going. Or the Green Line planning, another example from the Twin Cities. So lots of agencies doing good things that we see around the country. The dashboard, which I just described to you, is just one of many tools. And like anything else, and this goes back to my main point, that it's about who has power in our society and who wields power. These tools do not make decisions themselves. They inform decisions. And who is making those decisions and who is in the room is really the key thing to make use of any of these tools. So I look forward now to hearing from my ally, Jessica, and thank you again, Dr. Bills, and look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, David, for that presentation and for sharing with us a really exciting tool that's available from Transit Center. I want to remind our audience to please enter your questions that you have for David, as well as our previous speaker and our upcoming speaker, into the Q&A, and we'll pull from that list during our discussion period. So let's now move on to our last speaker, certainly not the least. We have Jessica Meany, who's going to give her presentation in response to our speakers. Jessica.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Bills, and good afternoon, everyone out there. I can see a lot of the attendees and a lot of familiar names and friends and partners. So really honored to get a chance to talk for a little bit and share my perspectives. Wanted to kind of lift up two people that are really close to me and inform a lot of work. One particularly really close, but we've been working at Investing in Place for a few years with a group, women's center down in South. It's called South Central Lamp. It's at Central and Slauson. And a few years ago, we wanted to do like a mini documentary on one of the moms. And this brave soul, Mara Martinez, volunteered. And we followed, the documentary filmmaker followed her around on a Saturday. And it's very tender. I encourage you to watch the video. It's about 4 minutes long. But in it, Mara talks a lot about how she wants to pamper her kids. And one of the things she does is she takes them to Chuck E. Cheese. And she takes them to Chuck E. Cheese. They don't have a car. And she takes them to Chuck E. Cheese, and it's 1.5 hours and 2 buses, one way to get there. She talks about the stress on the bus, how it's sometimes crowded, how she fears getting separated from her children, the unreliability, and some of the follow-up conversations we've talked about, the crummy sidewalks, the no shade. But she perseveres and is filled with joy. And just like a lot of us want to make sure our families have a good Saturday. We've done a lot of listening sessions with Mara and her colleagues at South Central Lamp, and I've always been so inspired by how the women take care of each other. They have an informal car share. They talk a lot about the challenges on getting their kids to doctor's appointments, as well as getting their kids to one school on one side of town and the other on the other side of town. And when I saw Mara a few years ago, she had her 3rd baby, and it was super exciting. And she was also really excited because she bought a car. And thank goodness she was able to really provide for our family. And I think about transportation as we all want to provide for our families. We want to live in wonderful cities. We want to be independent. And I think a lot about my brother-in-law, Lennon, who is an essential worker. And thankfully, he was able to keep his job for most of COVID. And he is a dishwasher, and he would catch the bus in Echo Park and have to get to Glendale. And he gets off his shift a little after 11, and he would tell me that if he missed his bus, he would have to wait an hour to get home. And I would be like, London, you should talk to your boss and let them know the schedule. Maybe can you get out, make sure you got, and he wasn't comfortable doing that. He also really loved his independence. And my husband and his brother would sometimes pick him up and take him to work. But he liked to do his own thing. And I would worry about him. Late at night, was the bus going to come? How important that income was to him and his mother who he supports, all throughout COVID. And I think about transportation as a way to see our friends, our families, to get to the ocean, to get to the beach. And I really I have to reflect how challenging it is in the Los Angeles area that our buses are worse now than they were 20 years ago. And that's pre-COVID. And I worry about when I hear things like we are building the world's biggest public infrastructure program, but you can reach 17 times more destinations with a car than transit. And who rides transit in LA, right? Extraordinarily poor people who are surviving on very limited incomes, who predominate Latino, Black. And so how do we not center our work on improving transportation options and race? We can't possibly. But for me, the path I've chosen in this field is it all comes down to money. Does the rhetoric we say in our plans and in our policies match with how we should invest our shared tax dollars? And so like for me, I think sometimes people say that expression, budgets are a reflection of values, or it's a moral document, or things like that. And I would just want to riff a little bit off what David was saying. To me, budgets are a reflection of power. There's a handful of people who decide where our billions of dollars go. We've been doing a bunch of research in concert with our Moms in Mobility campaign and trying to understand where our money is going, where our shared money is going. And so kind of like, I believe, not only do we have to question what the heck is going on, how are we an $8 billion transit agency and buses are worse now? Why are we not able to retain bus operators? There's all these critical questions that are not easy, of course, right? But how do we move past ideas of defining, measuring plans and actually look at what we can do today? I don't think we can wait anymore. And I worry actually about the word equity. Is that like sustainability or active transportation? It becomes its own department. I really want to see it infused in everything. And for me, my path that I've chosen is I believe in transparent and accessible budgets. And so can the women at South Central LAMP call their council member and say, this is what I want to participate? Or can it like also just be easier for them to understand what's available? So those are some of my big things. I just wanted to ground my perspective on this issue, on what's happening on the streets today and through COVID. And I would think like, if you're out there, one question I have, like, if you work at a transit agency, do you think the buses were better during COVID and how the response was? If you work at a transit agency, do you know how your budget's decided? And I think for students out there who might be listening, to take a municipal budgeting class. I think it's really critical, and people can often intimidate other people into like, oh, it's so complicated. I definitely hear that a lot when I talk to people who work in budget departments. We're very kind, but often it's really tricky to learn the ins and outs, but stay persistent and reach out to me, and I'd love to talk about budget stuff with anyone. But I think, Dr. Bills, that's it from sort of my perspective.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jessica, for sharing that feedback. I think that we've heard a lot of great discussion already. So at this time, we're going to transition from our presentations to our open question session. So I am going to take this opportunity to ask the first question. If we could have our speakers, Nalongo and David, to join us on screen. Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask the first question, and then we'll pull from our Q&A. So my first question is really about MTC's equity platform, although of course I would be happy to hear feedback from David and Jessica as well. So I'm really excited to learn about this platform. Right now I sit in Michigan, so I'm sort of tunnel vision on issues in Detroit area. But I'm really excited to hear that you all are focused on transforming how we think about equity, how we think about implementing principles in terms of delivering services to communities, to the Bay Area. And so my question is related to how the 4 steps or the 4 pillars of the platform are interconnected. So for example, I spend a lot of my time focusing in that first pillar, which is the define and measure. How do we measure equity? How do we understand how society is impacted by transportation investments, and differentially, what's the distribution of impacts? So I focus a lot in that area. In my line of work, I know how dependent it is, how dependent the measures that we use is on what we learn from the community. So trying to make sure that the measures we use sort of align with the experiences. And so it occurs to me that there's a lot of points of connectivity between these pillars, right? Where the measurement, which is the first pillar, but it's in a way dependent on what you learn from that second pillar, which is the listen and learn. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if you can.
I can jump in here. So
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bills, for the question. I love talking about the equity platform. I'm sort of new to it since I'm new to MTC, but Therese kind of came in, full steam ahead with this framework. And I think to sort of answer your question is that we present the equity platform as 4 distinct pillars, but it's probably more helpful to think of it as a circle, right? They're so interconnected. And I think it's just one of the sort of flaws of the presentation is that it's like the first pillar and the second pillar and the third and the fourth, when in fact, these things are sort of ongoing all the time, right? So at some point, unless you're dealing with a pilot where you don't necessarily, like you're setting up your metrics, you're probably in that you've delivered on something and it may not have resulted in what you wanted. And so you're kind of in the, we defined, we have metrics, maybe they're not the right things, right? Maybe we're not capturing the correct data, but you're also listening and learning from the community because they're probably the ones saying, we don't know what you did, but whatever it was wrong. I think to Jessica's point, wherever you put that $100 million, it wasn't in my community and it didn't alleviate my concerns, right? And so part of that listening and learning is learning and then, focusing those investments on transforming whatever it is that you're working on, right? So it's really trying to deliver on the needs that have been identified by the community. I think, we're sort of at this pivotal time, and I don't know, COVID sort of brings it into relief, but I think it was happening before COVID, especially here in the Bay Area with our stark sort of inequities in this like really rich sort of environment, to see folks who've just not been able to participate. For the planners, they're very like, here's my plan, here's my thing, and I'm done. And, when it comes to applying this platform, talking to people, getting that sort of feedback from them, listening to them and letting the concerns of the community drive the projects and not having it come from the ivory towers of MTC is a growth opportunity. So again, the pillars kind of more of a circle and they overlap quite substantively, but I think the main thing here is that it's ongoing and it's just an iterative process. And you just are in a constant state of learning and receiving feedback and interacting and sort of building on relationships. That is the ultimate goal, right? Right now, it feels very new for a lot of folks at our agency and probably new for the community. I don't know if they're sort of used to this new and more approachable planning organization, but we're still committed, right? Because it's really important that we're not just designing to spec, but that we're actually providing value to the people in the region, especially those who have been negatively impacted by our policies in the past, not just those who are currently, disenfranchised, but it's like you're really behind the curve. I think one of our slides showed that, someone was 118% of their income to housing. And it's like, how is that possible? Because people were in debt and trying to figure out how to pay for their housing, right? So you're always behind the curve there. So, this platform, this process framework, I think is just, it's less the steps. And I think, more a circle, or I think we use another graphic of a figure 8 so that you're constantly receiving, giving, and sort of building on that relationship.
Thanks so much for that response. So now at this time, I want to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. We have an agent who's been working behind the scenes to curate these questions. So I want to introduce Jacob Wasserman. Jacob, if you would at this time introduce either the question askers or oh, okay, looks like we don't have anyone who will give their questions, so I can just read through from the Q&A box. Okay.
Right. I'll make an observation on
Oh, okay.
I want to amplify, if you don't, if you're looking for a little space filler here. I was really inspired by some of what Nalongo said, and just from an institutional, this is again my point on governance and institutions and the integration that MTC is trying to do, that you should appreciate that in California, that the MP, and I remember I come from, 8 years as head of the MPO in Portland, so I have kind of a bias toward MPOs, but MTC and California generally, strong MPOs can be an important force. That's probably not the case so much in Detroit. It's certainly not the case here in New York, but that you have state policies in terms of devolution of funds from Caltrans, and that MTC has taken advantage of that. I think it strengthens the organization. I mean, it looks like a bridge too behind Longo. There was actually an ATM, right? I mean, it's an MPO that has money, and money is power, and that's important. They can help, to do things, and they've had strong leadership in Teresa, and then, Steve Heminger was a very strong leader, and the ability to do things like the Clipper card. This is validating, I think, what Longo said. These are real things for real people, and it wasn't necessarily the MPO's business to come up with the Clipper card, but they did it. They put themselves in that space, and it makes the other things easier. So that's just as a non-Californian to make you appreciate some of the advantages you have. I think some of the obstacles to fulfilling that is until recently, the absence of any kind of regional perspective on housing, and how parochial and fragmented that is in your region. And now the state legislature has kind of come around, and maybe that's going to change too. And that's a huge help. Again, getting these institutions aligned to fulfill a plan, because so much of yours is housing, which until recently was sort of beyond MTC's control, and now that we've not under MTC's control now, but the state is going to regulate it or deregulate it really in a different way. So.
Right, and just to tack onto that, MTC is in a unique position, as David sort of mentioned, because we have been tasked with sort of operating 7 of the 8 state-owned bridges in the area. Yeah. So that does give us sort of money in hand to kind of address some of these things. And so one of those things is the Clipper card. I know we kind of really glossed over that, but the Clipper card was a pilot when I first started. I think there was 4 participating transit agencies. And what it does is it's one of the first means-based programs that we've adopted in transit in our region. And so it used sort of existing, I think if you qualified, I can't quite remember, if you qualified for SNAP, then you got, 50% off, certain transit agencies were giving 25% off here. And so it was hugely successful. And then COVID hit, and then it became important to sort of push this out. And there were, to their credit, I think 17 additional transit agencies who said, oh, by means, please sign us up. And so now there's 21 who are signed up for this program where they offer, 50%, 20%, 50% or a 20% discount. And so that's huge, and it's ongoing. And, initially MTC funded for those 4 initial participants, we funded some of that, seed money for that. But a lot of the transit agencies use their discretionary funds for that. And then for the next 17, when we got the CARES Act funding that came in, I believe in January of 2020, they agreed to set aside money to support this program for the additional 17 participants plus the original 4. So it really does show a commitment, for the most part, region-wide of these transit operators to really trying to provide real, day-to-day, benefits to those who are most transit dependent, which tend to be those who are low-income earners. They don't have a car. So some of our other great strategies aren't really going to help them. And I think, as we pointed out, the quality of transit isn't really affected by our long-range plan. And so, we're trying to take it one step at a time, but the Clipper card was something that we enacted a couple of years ago that was one of those sort of immediate impacts to help improve people who have to use transit.
And I think that strengthens your political hand as an MPO, that you in your remarks, you said MTC at Ivory Tower, and that's not true. You're actually a provider of infrastructure that people are using every day. And that
and we're getting in the housing sphere. I don't want to take up all the time, but yes, they passed AB 1487, which made us a housing infrastructure agency. And so that means we can actually finance some housing endeavors. And we're actually in the process of starting a pilot there too. So.
Awesome, thank you. So let's have one question from our audience. We have Anson Stewart.
Hey, thanks a lot. It's nice to see people here. Might be a little nicer to see people in Arrowhead. I think the last time we were there, there was a Dodgers Red Sox series going on, and we may be on that path again. So hi, everyone from the Boston area, Anson Stewart. Just wanted to ask a quick question about some federal efforts to incorporate some of the access to opportunities type metrics that David mentioned through the dashboard. Seems like there's some traction to actually bring these into the way USDOT evaluates equity, into the way FTA evaluates capital funding. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about, prospects for that and some of those changes at the federal level. And then an extension, how could metrics like those incorporate concerns like capacity and reliability? I think, Dr. Bills, you've done some research on incorporating reliability into this accessibility framing. And I'd love to hear thoughts on ways to kind of unify some of this federal policy around access to opportunity metrics that incorporate the things that matter to transit practice. Thanks.
Yes, so I don't know, I was hoping that we could have our panelists respond first, and then I'll jump in.
Sure. We've been talking to USDOT folks on that. I gotta say, the last time I saw Anson Stewart in person was at the UCLA campus in Westwood. It wasn't at Arrowhead. And while we're at it, while he's talking about baseball, you've opened the door. This Californian's talking about tonight's a big deal, that the Dodgers and the Giants have their decisive playoff game. Fact is, as a New Yorker, They played 70 years ago this month was the shot heard around. The Giants and the Dodgers actually had a decisive playoff game in 1951. So I don't need to hear California saying this is historic or something. It happens every 70 years, okay? So to your question, I think the prospects are good. There's two signs of that. One in terms of the request for information that the FDA has put out. One just closed yesterday, which was asking for comments on the Capital Improvement Grant Program. And we commented, many of our allies did, National Association of City Transportation Officials, transit agencies, Natural Resources Defense Council. It shows an openness on the part of the new administration to reevaluate how they are awarding those grants, which in our view, and it's on our blog today, actually we posted our letter on the blog, transitcenter.org. So it's up there if you'd like to read what we commented to the FTA last night. Kind of favor that equity was really not a factor. And you look at what the awards over the last 20 years have been sort of low ridership, longer distance to low density areas. The other RFI they had out, which we also commented on, was like, how should they be looking at equity and some of these measures? And so, and again, we commented, a lot of our allies commented on that too. So I think both those things show an openness, as well as the president's personal official comments, his executive orders. Those have been echoed both rhetorically as well as in terms of potential rulemakings by Secretary Buttigieg. So we're optimistic, but we have to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, and I wanted to also try and tackle the bit about accessibility and reliability. There's a lot of discussion about how, when you think about reliability, this idea that the travel time you experience may not be the same every time, right? There's some variation. And so when you think about it, that can affect the accessibility landscape. If, for example, you're riding transit, your travel time experience could be affected by operations, perhaps a missed bus, lengthened waiting time, or other operation related aspects. And so because this picture, the travel time experience can change, that means that the number of opportunities you have access to can change as well. And so I want to kind of, spin this into a question, and talk about the equity platform that's put out by the Transit Center. What are your thoughts on, making sure that over time we can grow in the robustness of these accessibility measures and in the capabilities of the current platform addressing that?
Was that for me specifically? I know Jessica's probably got a lot of thoughts on reliability and the importance to riders as well.
It doesn't have to be specific to the transit platform.
Currently it's not part of our dashboard, just the data complications, but I totally agree with your premise. It is actually one of the factors that is most important to riders. And theoretical headway of every 15 minutes is one thing, but when you're actually having two buses come at once and then there isn't a bus for 29 minutes, that's actually it doesn't provide the utility that the theory would indicate. So that's an important factor.
Yeah, I think in general, it's just important to recognize that picture of, levels of accessibility across demographics, that can be even further skewed by this idea of travel time reliability.
Well, and Dr. Bills, I would add a little on that, like the data on that's really crummy. We can't, for the life of us, get Metro to release stop level data during COVID. So LA had the least amount of bus ridership loss across the country during COVID. And some routes, we know anecdotally stayed 60-70% of riders, predominantly San Fernando Valley, South Central. But we don't really have the data because it's all mushed up with automatic passenger counters or modeling or funny numbers, and so I think for where my heart is starting to really go is let's get out there and ride the buses and actually talk to the users who are closer to the problem and closest to the solution, because it's also like, what's the feedback loop for the transit agency on what's happening in the field on buses? Forget rail, just if, at least in Los Angeles, I only really know about the LA region, because the majority, 70% of our transit trips in the LA region are on the buses. And a lot of people who ride rail, skew wealthy, whiter, access to power, Twitter, right? So what surprised me when I heard in the operations committee a while ago at Metro is the way they're getting feedback from what's happening in real time on the buses is predominantly Twitter. And then I went and looked up the demographics of who uses Twitter, right? White, wealthy, graduate school. Radically different than who is riding the buses during COVID. And so what's the feedback loop for real-time stuff, especially if you're a region where the buses stink and a lot of the professionals are not riding them themselves? Like, how do we even know what's happening in the field? And those who might be riding it during COVID are just are too busy with other things to testify at a board meeting like I do, you know?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we'll move on here. I can certainly spend a lot more time talking on this subject. I mean, that's really consistent with what we're finding. We're both using survey data as well as the automated vehicle data to try and get a picture of what reliability looks like, and it's a really challenging question. So, so with that, let's move on to our next question. So we have a question by Jen.
Yeah, thanks so much. So this is a question specifically regarding something Jessica said, but obviously everyone is free to weigh in. So thank you for sharing the anecdotes. I thought those were really powerful. And I think you mentioned a few times how buses are worse today than they were 20 years ago. And I'm sure that's true. I think I resonate with that, but I'm not sure what that means. And if you could, I'd love it if you can specify.
Sure. Yeah. Longer waits, less reliable, slower travel speeds is kind of where it is. And Jen, I chatted in the question on link to a blog post where my brilliant colleague, Scott Frazier, goes deep with all the receipts you can see. But basically in the LA region, thanks to the leadership of the NAACP, the Bus Riders Union, Connie Rice, we're home to the largest transit racism lawsuit in the country in the 90s, where Metro was sued and ultimately settled under the rationale that they were investing more into rail for white riders at the expense of Black and brown riders in the bus. That was called the consent decree, which forced Metro to increase buses on the street. When it ended in 2006, we've seen a steady cut in buses, as well as in buses on the street, as well as bus speeds go down, right? So less buses, going slower, longer waits at the stop is kind of what Scott's research showed. And then you talk to any community member who relies on a bus, and they'll tell you it's worse. I rode the bus in the 90s in LA, and it does seem worse, even though we have all these apps that say it's coming in 20 minutes.
Can I just, I'm going to amplify and actually give a lot of credit to Jessica and her organization and their allies, that these conditions that she's describing in terms of bus deterioration, these are not sort of acts of God, right? These are prioritizations. These are decisions made by board members, executives, planners, our society. And it's rooted in racism or a lot of other historic factors. And it's very recent. It's today, right? The cuts during COVID on the bus side, were disproportionate relative to rail. And then a victory that Jessica and her group had was the restoration. You want to tell that story, Jessica, that you really did mobilize riders? And this is, again, it's our point at Transit Center. It's about mobilizing the latent power that is already out there and untapped to get service restoration. Isn't that right? Isn't that a victory you had?
Yeah. I mean, I'm so hungry for a panel in LA that's like, we are so many smart people with brilliant ideas. Why are things getting worse, not better? And I would say it's not because of a lack of money in LA, but David's right. So partners like the Bus Riders Union, ACT LA, Strategic Alliance for a Just Economy, LA Ford, lots of groups. When COVID started in March 2020, Metro made a unilateral decision to cut 20% of transit service, bus and rail. No meetings, no public hearings, no nothing. And when they went to codify it for another 12 months in September of 2020, we rallied with lots of community members to amplify voices on what's happening in the streets in September, right? And Director Bonnet was drew attention to it, talked about it. We rallied again in early December, you need to restore bus service. We rallied again in January, you need to restore bus service. In February 2021, we saw the board act with a motion that said by June 30th, I guess it was January, they said by June 30th, we're going to restore bus service. Then a few months later, we learned that that wasn't feasible because they had not lifted the hiring freeze for more bus operators. And then we're now in a cycle of a shortage of bus operators. And while the voices are there and we see leadership from the Metro Board to restore service, we're still not fully restored for a lot of complicated reasons. But boy, did community members have to show up at every single meeting to ask for that. It was insane. And in LA, like a lot of you probably know, we pay for our transportation with sales tax dollars. So the person who's waiting for the bus is paying the same as somebody who has a really nice car and is like able to get their COVID shot without having to be freaked out. But like, so it is racism, and it is. And I can see Wally is commenting, like, I think for me, it's like, how do we not romanticize transit in LA in our professional settings and like actually talk about what we're doing here with our billions of dollars. And what's top of mind for me today is, I don't know if y'all have seen that news about the ports going 24/7, right, to help with our backlog. And I can see our environmental justice partners like East Yard saying, what about the impact to our neighborhoods, right? And so where are our metropolitan planning organizations in real time addressing some of these equity issues? And like, that's where my heart is. It's no longer an academic conversation. How do we actually actualize this stuff with real dollars today is what I'm curious about.
Awesome. So we're going to take one last question. So we'll have Jacob read out the last question.
Hey, thanks so much. And thanks to all the panelists for the great discussion so far. I have a question from Miwa Matsuo, who asks, what drives transportation costs to such a high level in the Bay Area? And I'll add, probably close behind LA, New York, and other big metro areas. I guess transit is not the main driver of the cost. How would you reduce the costs if transit expense is not the main driver of transportation costs?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that, our urban planners didn't plan for transportation. They planned for cars, and then they put roadways in historically Black and low income earner neighborhoods and called it a done deal. And so it's a little bit like trying to fix an issue where it's incredibly challenging. In the San Francisco Bay Area, they're trying to, after 10 years of doing what are they calling it? The underground subway in San Francisco, right? It's like billions of dollars over budget, but I mean, it's just, we're planning transportation after the fact. And it's made more difficult because we can't just raise Black and brown neighborhoods and throw up a freeway, which we did in the past, right? So, there was a great story recently about the fight to put BART in Berkeley underground because they wanted to just run it through, this historically Black middle-class neighborhood. And they got together and they said, absolutely not, right? So I think, places like New York, I'm so envious. I lived there for a time. My family's from there. You go and you're just like, oh my goodness, you have an entire subway system, tunnels, throughout everything, and a million bridges, and you can use public transit. I mean, here, we're still trying to find streets to put buses on because, there's folks who are like, not down my street, but they have a car, right? Or they're lucky enough to have 5 other buses that stop within a block of their house. So it's just a complicated issue. And I think when you start having to factor all these things in place, plus California, bless us, our environmental considerations, which I think are absolutely right to have, that also complicates things on what we can do. I think Jessica mentioned, the impacts, air quality, sound quality, health. So all those contribute to the overall cost of these transportation projects. But we have an issue just delivering on capital projects anyway. And so it's not just transportation, it's housing. I mean, it's sort of any large scale transportation project that we're trying to address, because everything is delayed. So that's my spiel.
let me plug, in terms of cost of construction, and again, New York is actually worse, worst in the nation, and not proud of it, or we're not anyway. So let me just plug, we helped to fund the Eno Center, did a really, really useful report that covers San Francisco and Los Angeles. They're doing a 3-day webinar next. I hope it's okay that I'm mentioning one organization. I thought you're not like a competitor with UCLA. That is a webinar next week about cost of construction at enotrans.org. And basically the bottom line was the things that get scapegoated, it's not the full explanation. It's more complicated. It's, say, well, we have old cities. Well, as if London's not old, as if Paris is not old, or, well, or the right wing will say, oh, it's these environmental regulations in the United States. Well, Scandinavia's got tougher environmental regulations. And, it's, their cost is half. Or people say, oh, those, lazy feather bedding workers and the strong union. It's like, we've got the weakest unions in the world now, well, the developed world. And again, Scandinavia, far stronger labor protections than we do, and that they're doing things more efficiently. So it's all about governance. It's all about kind of decision making. And so read the Eno report or attend their webinar next week.
And can I just jump in and add too? I think we also need to let the young folks lead this charge. They're innovative, right? Using new technologies, new approaches, new ideas. I mean, a lot of these things can streamline some of these challenges that we're having. I mean, I know in the housing sector, there's a number of folks who are thinking of really innovative ways to make that more affordable, to actually just build housing. And I think it's important that we learn what these things are and that we really support them. And I think some of this is like old guard versus new guard. So I think that's also something to keep track of and to sort of bring in those fresh ideas, those bold ideas, because I think that's just how we're going to move the needle.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect note to close on. So at this time, I'd like to thank our speakers for a really engaging discussion and series of presentations. I'd also like to thank our session sponsor, Caltrans. And I also want to invite the audience to join us for the next session of Transit in Transition on Thursday next week. Thanks so much for joining us. And for more information, please visit our website.